I made the decision to move in with my parents, Julia. If you're not on board with this, then let's get a divorce, he declared, his voice void of emotion. The audacity of his words felt like a sudden slap across my face, leaving me stammering, my mind racing. What are you talking about, Alan? I managed to utter. His eyes were cold and calculating as he continued. It's simple. We'll use your $2 million inheritance to build a house there. That's the plan. And not tightened in my stomach. The inheritance, my mother's final gift to me, now a tool in Alan's scheme. You can't be serious, I whispered in disbelief. Oh, I'm dead serious, Julia. It's time to make some changes, he replied, his tone sharp. Memories of our life together flashed before me. The laughter, love, the birth of our children. How did we end up here? At 38, a mother of two, living what I thought was a normal life with a man I once loved. Yet, Alan stood before me, a stranger. He had always been a bit controlling, but I never imagined this. You have no right to decide how my inheritance is used, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Alan smirked. As your husband, I think I do. It's either my way or the highway, Julia. Decide. I stared at him, searching for a trace of the man I married, but all I saw was a greedy stranger eyeing my inheritance like a vulture. In that moment, standing in the shadow of the man I no longer recognized, I realized that my marriage was a lie. Fine, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. If that's how you want it, we're done. Of course, don't expect to touch a dime of my money. Alan's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of shock. He hadn't expected this. He turned on his heel and left, slamming the door behind him. Alone in that moment, my heart pounded in my ears, and the battle lines were drawn. This was no longer just about money. It was about my dignity, my freedom. As silence enveloped me, one thing became clear. I wouldn't let Alan destroy me. I would fight back. The next morning, the house felt eerily silent as I prepared breakfast. My mind replayed the previous night's confrontation with Alan. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could he be so callous? The money was a part of my mother's legacy, not some lottery windfall for Alan to squander. Our children, Emma and Ryan, noticed the tension but remained quiet. They were too young to understand the complexity of adult conflicts, yet they sensed something was amiss. I forced a smile for their sake. After dropping them off at school, I drove to my mother's now empty house, echoing with memories. Sitting in her living room, I recalled the numerous times Alan's parents had made insensitive remarks about our lifestyle, our choices, even our children. They had always favored traditional gender roles, and unfortunately, Alan seemed to have inherited their archaic views. I don't understand why you're still working, Alan's mother once sneered. A woman's place is at home with her children. Alan never stood up for me. He always brushed off their comments, telling me to ignore them. But how could I? Their words were like needles pricking away at my self-esteem. Now, with my mother gone and my marriage crumbling, resentment surged toward Alan. He had never truly been my partner. He had left me to fend for myself against his parents' criticisms, never once taking my side. I remembered when I was pregnant with Emma and how Alan's parents had openly expressed their hope for a grandson. When Emma was born, their disappointment was palpable. Next time, make sure it's a boy, they had said, barely concealing their dissatisfaction. It was painful seeing my daughter subjected to such blatant favoritism. And now, Alan wanted to use my inheritance to move closer to them, to immerse ourselves in their toxic environment. The thought made my blood boil. I refused to let it happen. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of my mother's life, a plan began to form in my mind. I wouldn't be bullied into submission. I would fight back, not just for myself, but for my children too. Alan had revealed his true colors, and it was time for him to face the consequences. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for war. In the following days, I dedicated myself to gathering documents and preparing for the legal battle ahead. My lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Miss Henderson, assured me that we had a strong case. Don't worry, Julia. We'll make sure that inheritance stays where it rightfully belongs, she said with a confident smile. One evening, as I sorted through some of my mother's belongings, I stumbled upon an old, dusty envelope tucked away in a drawer. Inside, I found a set of documents, stock certificates, and property deeds. My hands trembled as I realized the extent of my mother's secret savings, including the current value of the stocks and the value of the property. It amounted to a staggering $2 million. I couldn't believe it. My mother, who had lived so modestly, had been sitting on a small fortune. She had always been prudent with money, but I never imagined she had accumulated so much. A note accompanied the documents, written in my mother's neat handwriting. Julia, I saved this for a rainy day. I hope it gives you and the kids a better life. Use it wisely. Tears welled up in my eyes. My mother's foresight and love felt like a warm embrace, even from beyond the grave. The next day, I decided to confront Alan. He needed to know that his plan to squander my inheritance was doomed to fail. I found him in the living room, lazily flipping through a magazine. Alan, we need to talk, I said, my voice steady. He looked up, a hint of annoyance in his eyes. What is it now, Julia? I found something of my mother's, I started, holding up the envelope. Turns out she left me stocks and properties worth $2 million. Alan's eyes widened, a mix of shock and greed flashing across his face. $2 million? That's great news. His reaction disgusted me. Don't get any ideas, Alan. This money is mine and the kids. You won't see a cent of it. His expression turned dark. You can't keep it all to yourself, Julia. We're married. What's yours is mine, he insisted. I felt a surge of anger. You've shown your true colors, Alan. You don't care about me or the kids. All you see is dollar signs. Alan stood up, his face red with anger. You're being selfish, Julia. I'm thinking about our future, about our family. What family, Alan? The one you're ready to abandon for your own selfish needs? I shot back. He took a step towards me, fists clenched. You'll regret this, Julia. I'll make sure of it. I stood my ground, unwavering. Bring it on, Alan. I'm not afraid of you anymore. He stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I knew this was just the beginning of a long and bitter battle. I was prepared for my children, for my mother's legacy, and for myself. The following week was a whirlwind of legal consultations and tense silences at home. Alan's attitude had shifted from shock to a cold, calculated aggression. He resembled a caged animal, desperate and dangerous. One evening, as the kids were asleep, Alan cornered me in the kitchen. His eyes were wild, his posture aggressive. You think you're clever, Julia, hiding that money from me. I leaned against the counter, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. It's not about being clever, Alan. It's about what's right. That money is for me and the kids, not for your deluded fantasies. He slammed his fist on the countertop, making me jump. I am your husband. I have rights to that money. You're just a... His words were like venom, but I cut him off. A what, Alan? A woman who won't bow down to your greed and bullying? His face contorted in anger. You'll regret this, Julia. I'll make sure you don't get a dime of that money. I could feel the danger in his words, but I refused to show fear. Is that a threat, Alan? He leaned in, his breath foul. It's a promise. I pushed past him, my body shaking with adrenaline. We'll see about that. The court will decide. As I walked away, his voice followed me, filled with malice. You're going to be left with nothing, Julia. Nothing. The next day, I received a call from my lawyer. Julia, Alan has filed for divorce. He's claiming half of your inheritance. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. Let him try. I'll fight him every step of the way. Miss Henderson's voice was firm. We have a strong case, Julia. Don't worry. We'll make sure justice is served. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about my children sleeping peacefully in their rooms. I was doing this for them, for their future. Alan had become a stranger to me, a man consumed by greed and spite. But I was no longer the woman he thought he could control and intimidate. I closed my eyes, envisioning the courtroom, the judge, the final verdict. I would stand tall, fight hard, and win, not just for the money, but for my dignity, for my children's future, and for the quiet strength my mother had always shown. This was my battle, and I was ready for it. The legal battle that ensued was grueling. Alan's strategy was clear: to paint me as an uncooperative wife, hoarding the family's resources. But his arguments were flimsy, rooted more in desperation than in law. One afternoon, we faced each other in mediation, a last attempt to settle before the court hearing. Alan sat across from me, his lawyer by his side, his gaze cold, his demeanor smug. "Let's be reasonable, Julia," his lawyer began. "Alan is entitled to a portion of this inheritance. It's only fair." I glanced at Miss Henderson, my resolve steel. "Fair. Alan has made no contribution to this inheritance. It is solely from my late mother, intended for me and my children." Alan leaned forward, his voice dripping with scorn. "Oh, come on, Julia. You're just being spiteful. Don't you think the kids would want their father to have a share?" I felt a surge of anger. "This isn't about spite, Alan. It's about what's just. You've never cared about what the kids want. This is about your greed." His lawyer tried to interject, but Alan raised his hand, signaling him to stop. "You think you can just take everything, don't you, Julia? Play the grieving daughter and the victimized wife." I met his gaze squarely. "This isn't a game, Alan. You're the one trying to take what isn't yours." The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, interjected, "Let's try to remain civil. This is about finding a resolution." Alan cut her off, his voice rising. "A resolution? She's the one being unreasonable." I could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating. I spoke calmly yet firmly. "I am being perfectly reasonable. I'm protecting what my mother left for her grandchildren. Alan's claims are baseless." The mediator called for a break, sensing the futility of the discussion. As we stood up, Alan leaned in close, his breath hot on my ear. "You'll pay for this, Julia. I'll make sure of it." I walked out of the room, my heart racing but my spirit unbroken. Alan's threats were empty, his case weak. I knew the law was on my side, and I was determined to see this through to the end. In the following weeks, I pored over legal documents, met with Miss Henderson, and prepared for the court hearing. The kids stayed with my sister, shielded from the worst of the storm. I missed them terribly, but I knew this fight was for their future as much as it was mine. The day of the hearing arrived. I stood in the courtroom ready to face Alan and whatever lies he planned to spin. This was it, the moment of truth, and I was ready to fight with everything I had. The courtroom was a battleground where words were wielded like swords. Alan's lawyer painted a picture of a husband wronged, deprived of his rightful share. But under Miss Henderson's skilled questioning, his arguments crumbled like a house of cards. During a recess, Alan cornered me in the hallway, his face twisted in fury. "You're ruining everything, Julia. You think you're going to walk away with all that money." I stood my ground despite the fear gnawing at me. "It's not your money, Alan. It never was." He stepped closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "I'll drag this out as long as it takes. I'll bleed you dry in legal fees." I met his gaze, my voice unwavering. "Do what you must. I won't let you bully me into submission." As we returned to the courtroom, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. Alan's threats were hollow, his bravado a mask for his desperation. The final verdict was a vindication. The judge ruled in my favor, recognizing the inheritance as my sole property. Alan's face as the judgment was delivered was a picture of defeat. But the victory was bittersweet. I had won the legal battle, but at what cost? My marriage was over, the family I had known shattered. In the weeks that followed, Alan's life unraveled. His reputation built on lies and intimidation crumbled. The community saw him for what he was, a greedy man who had tried to take advantage of his wife's inheritance. Rumors reached me about his struggles. He had lost his job, his friends, and his standing in the community. It was a steep fall from grace, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. One evening, I received a call from a mutual acquaintance. Julia, have you heard about Alan? I hesitated. No, what about him? He's moving out of town, lost his job, his house. He's pretty much broke. I felt a pang of not quite satisfaction, but something close. Alan had reaped what he had sown. He had tried to destroy me, but in the end, he had destroyed himself. I hung up the phone and looked at the picture of my children on the mantel. This fight had been for them, for their future and security. I had stood up to Alan, not just for myself, but for them. As I tucked them into bed that night, I felt a sense of peace. The battle was over, and we had emerged stronger. We were free from Alan's shadow, ready to start a new chapter. Our lives would be different, but we would be okay. We were together, and that was all that mattered. In the months that followed the court ruling, life settled into a new rhythm. The victory in court had given me a sense of closure, but it was the start of a new journey, one of healing and rebuilding. I decided to sell the house, the scene of so many bitter memories. As I packed up each item, I sorted through, a step away from my past with Alan. I was determined to create a better future for Emma and Ryan. One day, while going through some old boxes in the attic, I found a picture of Alan and me in happier times. For a moment, I allowed myself to grieve for the life I thought I had, the love I thought was real, but as I looked at his smiling face in the photo, I realized that the man I had married no longer existed. He had shown his true colors, and they were dark and ugly. I tossed the photo into the trash bin, a symbolic gesture of letting go. Moving to a new town brought a fresh start. I found a cozy home in a friendly neighborhood, and the kids enrolled in a new school, soon making friends. As for me, I began to focus more on my writing, finding solace in the worlds I created with my words. One evening, as I was tucking Emma into bed, she looked up at me with her big innocent eyes. "Mom, do you miss Dad?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes I miss who I thought your dad was. But we're better off now. We're a strong team, just the three of us." She nodded, a wise look in her young eyes. "I like it here, Mom. I liked our new home." Her words filled me with warmth. We had indeed come a long way. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the journey. Alan's downfall was his own doing. His greed and malice had backfired, leaving him with nothing. While I harbored no joy in his misfortunes, there was a sense of justice in how things had turned out. The kids and I had a long road ahead, but we were on the path to healing. The inheritance, now securely invested, would provide for their education and our future. I closed my eyes, thinking of my mother. Her strength and foresight had saved us. In her wisdom, she had given me the means to protect myself and my children. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, it had left clarity and hope. We had weathered the worst, and now a new day was dawning.